There is a hill in Massachusetts where the grass grows thin and pale, even in summer. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The hill sits just outside the old town of Salem, and locals have called it Gallows Hill for 300 years. The name is not a mystery. Everyone knows what happened there. 19 men and women were hanged on that hill in the summer and fall of 1692. One man was pressed beneath heavy stones until he died. Hundreds more sat in cold, dark jails waiting to find out if they would live or not. You've heard the story before, probably in school, probably in a few sentences. Girls started acting strange. The town panicked. People called it witchcraft. The courts hanged the guilty and the innocent alike. Then it stopped. Then everyone felt bad about it. That's the version most people carry around with them. It's not wrong exactly, but it leaves out the most interesting part. The most interesting part is the land. Salem in 1692 was not a peaceful place. It was a town cracked down the middle, split between two groups of people who had been fighting over the same patch of earth for decades. On one side sat Salem town, the port, the merchants, the money, the smell of salt water and fish, and fresh-cut timber waiting to be loaded onto ships. On the other side sat Salem Village, the farms, the mud, the hard winters, the people who grew the food and got very little in return. These two places shared a name and almost nothing else. The village wanted to be free of the town. They wanted their own church, their own minister, their own say over their own lives. The town wanted the village to stay put and keep paying taxes. This argument had been grinding on for years before anyone said the word witch. Now here is where the story gets quiet and strange. When the accusations started flying in early 1692, they did not fall randomly. They did not land on the wicked or the cruel or even the unpopular. They landed again and again on people who owned land that someone else wanted. They landed on people who had voted the wrong way in a church dispute. They landed on people whose property sat right along the fault line between the village and the town. This is the part that historians spent a long time Thomas Putnam filed more legal complaints during the Salem trials than almost anyone else. His family was one of the most powerful in Salem Village, and the people he accused, the ones his daughter and his wife and his neighbors pointed fingers at those people owned land that sat right next to his. Some of that land changed hands very quickly after the accusations were made. That is not a coincidence. Or if it is a very large one. The fog that hung over Salem that winter was thick and gray, the color of old pewter. The roads were frozen mud. The houses were small and dark, heated by fires that never quite drove out the cold. People lived close together and knew each other's business and had long memories for old grudges. Into that cold and that darkness came something that looked like religious panic. And maybe it was, in part. The Puritans believed in the devil the way they believed in the air they breathed. They believed he walked among them. They believed he made deals with weak souls. They believed a person could be a witch the same way a person could be a thief. But belief is a powerful tool, and in the right hands, it can be aimed. What happened in Salem was real. The fear was real. The suffering was real. The 19 people who died on Gallows Hill were real, and their names deserve to be spoken. But underneath the fear, underneath the prayers and the courtrooms and the confessions, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something that left a paper trail. Somebody got rich when the hangings stopped. Somebody walked away from that terrible summer with more land than they started with. And that somebody had a name. We're going to find it together, slow and easy, the way you find anything buried. One layer at a time, starting with the ground itself, the cold, contested, blood-soaked ground that Salem was built on. Picture a place where the trees never quite let go of the dark. Even in summer, the forests around Salem pressed close. The pines grew thick and tall, and their branches tangled overhead like the fingers of old men folding their hands. The light that made it through came in thin yellow strips. It fell across the ground in pieces. It never felt like enough. This was Massachusetts in 1692. The colony was barely 60 years old. The roads were mud tracks through the woods. The houses were small and low, built from rough timber, their walls stuffed with moss and clay to keep out the cold. Candles were expensive. Most families used tallow lamps. Animal fat burned slow and smoky, filling rooms with a greasy yellow glow that made everything look like it was underwater. You wore wool in winter and linen in summer. You wore the same clothes most days. You woke before dawn and worked until dark. The work was planting, hauling, chopping, mending. There was always more of it. There was never a day when the list ran out. And you went to church. You went twice on Sunday and sometimes more. The church was not just a building. It was the center of everything, your social life, your legal life, your sense of who you were and where you stood. The minister was the most powerful man in town. What he said on Sunday, people carried home and turned over in their heads all week. Now, here is the thing most people miss when they think about Salem. Salem was not one place. It was two. Salem town sat on the coast. It had a harbor. Ships came and went. Merchants grew rich on trade with England. The streets near the water smelled of salt and fish and tar. There were proper houses there, some of them 2 stories, with glass in the windows. There were goods from London, fabric, tools, spices. Money moved through Salem town the way water moves through a mill. It kept things turning. Salem Village was something else entirely. It sat about 7 miles inland, up through the trees, away from the harbor and the money and the ships. The soil there was rocky and thin. Farming it was hard work that paid poorly. The houses were smaller. The winters felt longer. The people who lived there looked at Salem town the way a hungry man looks through a tavern window. For decades, Salem Village had been trying to break away from Salem town. The villagers wanted their own church, their own minister, their own identity. They were tired of paying taxes to a town government that felt far away and didn't much care about them. They were tired of watching the merchants get rich while they pulled rocks out of frozen ground. The town looked back at the village the way a landlord looks at a tenant who keeps asking for things. This was not a small tension. It ran deep. It ran through families, through property lines, through old arguments about who owed what to whom. The village had finally gotten its own church in 1689, just 3 years before the trials began. But having a church didn't fix the resentment. It just gave it a place to gather. The village itself was divided. Some families had ties to Salem town. They traded there, had relatives there, thought of themselves as part of that world. Other families had no such ties. They were farmers, pure and simple, and they had no use for the town or its money or its ways. These two groups did not like each other. They argued over the minister. They argued over the church. They argued over land. The land was everything. In 1692, land was not just where you lived. It was your wealth, your future, your children's future. A man with good land could feed his family and leave something behind. A man without it had nothing to pass on. When a neighbor's fence crept 6 inches into your field, that was not a small thing. That was a threat to everything you had. So, when you picture Salem in the winter of 1692, don't picture one quiet little town. Picture 2 communities that had been grinding against each other for years. Picture old grudges wrapped in cold air. Picture men who smiled at each other on Sunday and then went home and counted their acres and thought about what they were owed. The forest sat around all of it, patient, dark. The branches moved in the wind off the harbor, and the sound they made was like whispering. Something was already building here before anyone said the word witch. To understand what happened in Salem, you have to understand what these people believed, not what we think they believed, not the cartoon version with pointed hats and cauldrons, what they actually, genuinely, in their bones believed. Puritans believed the devil was real, not a symbol, not a metaphor for human weakness. A real being with a real body who walked real roads and knocked on real doors. He had a face. He had a voice. He made deals. He shook hands. He left footprints in the mud outside your barn on a cold February morning. And if you looked close enough, you could see they weren't quite the shape of a man's foot. This wasn't superstition to them. It was theology. It was science. It was the most rational explanation for why bad things happened to good people in a world that God had made. Think about the life they were living. Salem Village in 1692 was not a comfortable place. The winters came hard off the Atlantic, gray and biting, full of ice and silence. The summers were short and uncertain. Crops failed. Children died of fevers that had no name. Cows went dry for no reason. Neighbors quarreled over fence lines and water rights and the price of grain. The forest pressed in from every side, dark and enormous, full of sounds that didn't always have an easy explanation. When something went wrong, these people needed a reason. And the reason their faith gave them was this: the devil was always working. He was always recruiting. He moved through the world like a cold wind through a cracked door, looking for the weak, the bitter, the lonely, the angry. He offered them power. He offered them relief. And some people, their faith told them, said yes. The person who said yes became a witch. Now, a Puritan witch wasn't the kind you see in storybooks. She didn't fly on a broom. She didn't brew potions in a black pot over a green flame. A Puritan witch was a person who had signed the devil's book. A real book, they believed, with real pages and real ink. When you signed it, you gave the devil your soul. In return, he gave you a specter, an invisible copy of yourself that could travel anywhere, slip through walls, cross miles in seconds, and do harm to anyone you chose. That specter was the key to everything that followed. Because here's what made the specter so dangerous as an idea. Nobody could see it, but the person it was tormenting. If your specter came to me in the night and pinched me and choked me and pressed the air from my lungs, I would wake up gasping and bruised and terrified. And when I told the magistrate what happened, I couldn't prove it. But I couldn't be disproved either. The specter was invisible. The evidence was invisible. The crime was invisible. All that existed was my word. The ministers of New England had been warning about this for years. Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village, preached about the devil with a fire in his voice that made the windows rattle. He was a small, sharp-featured man with dark eyes and a way of looking at a congregation like he was counting the sinners. He'd come to Salem after a failed career as a merchant in Barbados. He brought with him a deep suspicion of the world, a hunger for authority, and two enslaved people named Tituba and John Indian. Cotton Mather was another voice in this world. He was young, brilliant, and terrifying in his certainty. He'd already written a book about witchcraft in Boston. He believed every word of it. He had the kind of faith that doesn't leave room for doubt. And in 1692, that kind of faith was very, very dangerous. These were the men who shaped how Salem thought about evil. They built the framework. They handed the village a set of beliefs as solid and heavy as a stone wall. And when the girls started screaming in January of 1692, that wall was already in place, waiting. The ordinary people of Salem Village weren't cruel. Most of them were tired and cold and trying to survive. They loved their children. They tended their animals. They sat in hard wooden pews on Sunday mornings and listened to men like Paris tell them the devil was close. They believed it because everything in their lives told them the world was dangerous. They believed it because their faith was the only light they had. And when the accusations started, that light cast very long shadows. Picture a Massachusetts winter in 1691. Not the kind you read about in books. The real kind. The cold came in off the Atlantic like a slow, patient thing. It settled into the wood of the houses. It crept under the doors. It turned the mud of the village paths into iron. By December, the ground was frozen so hard you could knock on it like a door and hear nothing come back. Salem Village sat quiet under all that white. The fields were bare. The animals were pulled in close. The smoke from every chimney rose straight up into a sky the color of old pewter. Everything smelled like wood smoke and wet wool, and the faint sweetness of hay stored in the dark. This was ordinary life for the people of Salem Village. Not dramatic, not grand, just the slow, careful work of staying warm and staying fed when the world outside your door had gone cold and still. The days were short. The sun came up low and pale, barely clearing the tree line before it started to sink again. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was already going gold and thin. Families gathered close to their fires. Candles were expensive, so you used them carefully. You did your mending and your reading by firelight, and the shadows moved on the walls like living things. The Reverend Samuel Paris lived at the center of all this. His house sat near the village meeting house, a plain wooden building with no decoration and no warmth to spare. Paris had a daughter named Betty. She was 9 years old. He also had a niece named Abigail Williams, who was 11. Both girls lived in that house through that long, gray winter. They also had a slave named Tituba. She had come with Paris from Barbados. She cooked. She cleaned. She kept the house running while Paris wrote his sermons and worried about money and feuded with the men who ran the village. Tituba knew things about the world that the Puritan villagers did not. She had grown up somewhere warm and green and full of color, a world that felt very far away from the frozen fields of Massachusetts. The village itself was a small place, maybe 500 people, spread across farms and woodlots and narrow dirt roads that turned to mud in the thaw and ice in the freeze. Most families had been there for a generation. They knew each other the way people know each other when they cannot leave. They knew who owed who money. They knew whose cow had wandered into whose field. They knew the old arguments and the older grudges. The meeting house was the center of everything. You went there on Sundays. You sat on hard wooden benches for hours. You listened to Paris preach about sin and damnation and the ever-present danger of the devil. Then you went home and did it all again the next week. This was the rhythm of the place. Church, work, cold, sleep. Church, work, cold, sleep. The children of Salem Village had very little. No toys to speak of. No books except the Bible. No games that the church would approve of. The winter was long, and the house was small, and the days were all the same. For Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the hours inside that cold parsonage must have felt like they stretched on forever. So they gathered, not just the two of them, but a small circle of village girls. They came together in the kitchen of the Paris house, near the fire, in the warmth that Tituba kept going. They were bored. They were restless. They were girls in a world that gave girls almost nothing to do but wait. Tituba told them stories. That much seems certain. What kind of stories? Nobody knows exactly. Maybe stories from her home. Maybe things she had seen or heard or dreamed. The girls listened. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the windows. Outside, the village slept under its blanket of snow. This was the ordinary world of Salem in the winter of 1691. Cold and quiet and a little bit lonely. A small place full of small lives, all of them pressing up against each other in the dark. Nothing had happened yet. The fields were still. The court had not been called. Nobody had pointed a finger at anyone, but the girls were gathering, and Tituba was talking. And somewhere in that warm kitchen, in that circle of firelight, something was beginning to stir. It was small at first, the way all things are before they grow. It started small, the way most things do. January in Salem Village was a gray and grinding month. The sky sat low and heavy, the color of old pewter. Snow packed the roads into hard, rutted channels. The fields were buried. The livestock huddled close in their barns, breathing clouds of warm fog into the frozen air. People stayed inside. They prayed. They waited for spring the way you wait for something you're not sure is coming. Inside the parsonage on the hill, two girls had too much time and too little to do. Betty Paris was 9 years old. She was the daughter of Reverend Samuel Paris, the man who ran the village church, and some would say ran the village itself. Betty was small and quiet, the kind of child who watched more than she spoke. Her cousin Abigail Williams was 11. She lived in the parsonage too, sent there to help with the household. Abigail was different from Betty. Sharper, quicker, the kind of girl who filled a room without trying. They spent their days in that cold house, doing chores, sitting through long prayers, listening to the wind push against the shutters. There wasn't much else. Puritan children didn't play the way children play now. Fun was a word that made their fathers nervous. But there was Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved woman who worked in the Paris household. She had come from Barbados, brought to Massachusetts by Samuel Paris himself. She was warm where the house was cold. She told stories. She knew things that the Puritan books didn't cover. She knew the old ways of reading the future, the kind of knowledge that had traveled across the ocean in the memories of people who had nothing else left to carry. On those long winter evenings, a small circle of girls began to gather in the parsonage kitchen. Betty and Abigail were there. So were a few other girls from the village, older ones, 12 and 14 and 16. They sat close to the fire, the orange light moving across their faces, the rest of the room falling away into shadow. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees like something breathing. Tituba talked. She may have told fortunes. She may have cracked an egg into a glass of water, an old folk method for reading what the future held, who you might marry, what your life might look like. It was the kind of thing that women had done for centuries, quietly, in kitchens, far from the ears of men who would call it something worse than it was. Nobody wrote down exactly what happened in that kitchen. The record doesn't go that far. What we know is what came after. In late January, Betty Paris began to act strangely. She made sounds she couldn't explain. She threw herself on the floor. She crawled under furniture. She screamed at things that weren't there, or at least things that nobody else could see. Her body bent in ways that frightened the adults who watched. She complained that something was pinching her, biting her, pulling at her skin with invisible hands. Abigail started doing the same. The village doctor came. His name was William Griggs, and he examined both girls carefully. He found nothing wrong with their bodies. No fever, no injury, no sickness he could name. He stood in that cold room with his bag in his hand and said the only thing he could think of to say. The evil hand was upon them. That was the phrase he used. The evil hand. It was a Puritan way of saying that something supernatural had reached into these children and taken hold. It meant witchcraft. It meant someone in the village had made a deal with the devil and was using that power to hurt innocent girls. The word moved through Salem village the way fire moves through dry grass. People came to see. They stood in doorways and watched Betty crawl across the floor, her face blank and far away, her small hands clawing at the wood. They watched Abigail bark like an animal and then go still as stone. They didn't know what to do with what they saw. They had no other frame for it. Their whole world was built on the idea that God and the devil were real and present and active, Evil had a face, and a name, and a neighbor. All they had to do now was figure out whose name it was. The girls would tell them. They just needed a little more time, and a little more asking. Word spread the way it always does in a small place. Quietly at first, then all at once. By late January of 1692, the girls were still shaking. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams had not gotten better. They twisted. They cried out. They stared at things no one else could see. The village doctor had already said his piece. He had no medicine for this. What was happening to these girls, he said, was not of the body. It was of the devil. That word moved through Salem village like smoke through a cracked door. People gathered where people always gathered. The general store, the tavern, the cold stone steps outside the meeting house. They stood in clusters and kept their voices low. They had seen strange things before, some of them. Old-timers had stories. There was always a story. One man remembered a sickness that swept through a neighboring town 20 years back. Children had fallen into fits, then too. Nobody had ever explained it properly. Another woman said her grandmother had warned her about certain people. People who carried a coldness with them. People who could sour milk just by looking at it. These were the stories they told each other. Old stories, half-remembered things. The kind of knowledge that lives in the back of the mind and waits for a reason to come forward. The minister, Samuel Paris, pressed the girls for answers. He needed a name. The congregation needed a name. A sickness with no cause was terrifying. A sickness with a cause, even a terrible one, was something you could fight. 3 names came. The first was Tituba. She was the Paris family's slave, a woman from Barbados who had already been at the center of those winter gatherings with the girls. She was an outsider in every way that mattered in Salem village. She spoke differently. She looked different. She had told the girls stories from another world, stories full of spirits and signs and things that moved in the dark. When the pressure came down on her, she confessed. She said yes. She said she had seen the devil. She described him. She said others had signed his book too. That confession cracked the whole thing open. The second name was Sarah Good. She was a beggar woman. She wandered the roads of Salem village with her young daughter, asking for food and shelter. People had turned her away from their doors more than once. She muttered when she walked away. People remembered the muttering. They had always wondered what she was saying. Now they thought they knew. The third name was Sarah Osborne. She was an older woman who had stopped attending church. That alone made people suspicious. In a Puritan village, missing Sunday meeting was not just rude. It was a sign. It meant something was wrong with your soul. She had also been involved in a legal dispute over her late husband's land. She had remarried a servant, which the village found scandalous. She was not well liked. She had not been well liked for years. 3 women, a slave, a beggar, a social outcast. None of them had friends in high places. None of them had land worth speaking of. None of them had the kind of standing that made people think twice before pointing a finger. The village absorbed these names like dry ground absorbs rain. At the general store, men nodded slowly. They said they weren't surprised about Sarah Good. They said they'd always felt something off about her. At the tavern, someone recalled that Sarah Osborne had once let her cattle wander onto a neighbor's field and never properly apologized. Small grievances, old slights, they came back now, reframed, given new weight. This is how it works in a small place. You don't need proof. You need a story that fits. And the story of these 3 women fit the shape of what people already believed. The devil was real. He recruited the weak and the strange and the lonely. He found the ones who stood apart from the community, and he made them his servants. The girls had named them. The minister believed the girls. The congregation believed the minister, and the old-timers, with their half-remembered stories and their cold suspicions, believed all of it together. 3 women were arrested on February 29th, 1692. The snow was still on the ground. The trees were bare and black against a gray sky. The cold had not broken yet. And in the village, people pulled their coats tighter and told themselves that the worst was over now. That naming the thing would end it. They were wrong about that. They were very wrong. By February of 1692, 3 women had been named. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne Tituba, 3 names spoken out loud in a cold meeting house, and the town held its breath. Then the breath came out, and it didn't stop. Within weeks, the accusations moved like smoke through a cracked window. They slipped into every corner. They found new names, new faces, new families. And the more you watch how they spread, the more you start to notice something. The smoke didn't drift at random. It followed a path. To understand that path, you have to go back further than 1692. You have to go back to the land itself. The Namgig people lived along this stretch of Massachusetts coast for thousands of years before any English boot ever touched the shore. They called the river the Namgig. They knew the marshes, the tidal flats, the dark pine forests that ran north toward what would one day be called Andover. They knew which ground flooded in spring. They knew which hills held the cold longest. This was their home, and they understood it the way you understand a face you've looked at your whole life. The English came in the 1620s. They named the settlement Salem, from the Hebrew word for peace. It was not a peaceful place. The early settlers fought the land, fought the cold, fought each other. They cleared trees with axes and bare hands. They built homes from rough timber that smelled of sap and sawdust. They planted crops in rocky soil that didn't want to give. And they drew lines, property lines, fence lines, the lines that said this is mine and that is yours. Those lines mattered more than almost anything else in a Puritan town. Land was survival. Land was status. Land was the thing you left your children when you died. And in Salem Village, the land was never quite settled. Deeds overlapped. Boundaries shifted. Neighbors disputed corners and fence posts and stream edges for decades before the first girl ever fell to the floor shaking. The village itself had been carved out of Salem town only a generation before. The farmers of Salem Village had fought hard for that separation. They wanted their own church, their own minister, their own identity. But the split left wounds. Families on the western side of the village, further from the coast, further from the trade routes, felt left behind. They watched the merchants of Salem town grow rich while they pulled stones from frozen ground. Thomas Putnam felt that weight. His family had expected more. His father had owned significant land, and when the the estate was divided, Thomas got less than he believed he deserved. He was a man with a grievance that had been sitting in his chest for years, going cold and hard, like a coal that never quite burns out. His daughter Anne was one of the first girls to show signs. His wife Anne was one of the first adults to claim affliction. And Thomas Putnam himself became one of the most active voices in the legal proceedings that followed. He filed complaints. He gathered witnesses. He signed his name to document after document, and the names he helped bring forward were not random. Many of the accused lived on land that bordered the Putnam family's holdings. Many of them had been involved in prior disputes, property arguments, old feuds that had never been fully resolved. The accusations didn't just spread outward from the Paris household like ripples in still water. They moved with intention. They followed fence lines and property maps. Rebecca Nurse lived on a large farm to the north. Her family had a long history of tension with the Putnams over land boundaries. She was 71 years old, nearly deaf, known throughout the village as a woman of deep faith. She was the last person anyone would have called a witch, and yet her name came up. And Thomas Putnam's wife said she had seen Rebecca Nurse's shape tormenting her in the night. Martha Corey was another name that surfaced early. She had questioned the trials openly, said she didn't believe the girls were truly afflicted. Within days of speaking those words, she was accused herself. The pattern was already forming. Doubt the accusers and become accused. Own land someone else wanted and become accused. Stand in the wrong family's way and become accused. The smoke had a source. It had a direction. And if you were standing in Salem Village in the spring of 1692, watching your neighbors get dragged before the magistrates, you might have started to feel it. That faint, acrid smell in the back of your throat. The warmth that wasn't quite a fire. Something was burning, and it wasn't witchcraft. "300 years passed before anyone sat down with the records and really looked. His name was Charles Upham. He was a minister in Salem. He had lived there most of his life. He knew the old families. He knew the old grudges. And sometime in the middle of the 1800s, he started pulling documents out of dusty courthouse drawers and spreading them across a table. What he found kept him awake for years. Upham wasn't the first person to suspect something was wrong with the Salem story. People had whispered about it for generations, but he was the first person to do the slow, careful work of matching names to land records, of tracing who accused whom, and of asking the question that nobody had asked out loud: who benefited? The answer kept pointing to one man. Thomas Putnam was not a judge. He was not a minister. He held no official title during the trials. But when Upham laid out the accusations side by side, Putnam's name appeared again and again and again. He signed more formal complaints against accused witches than almost anyone else in Salem Village. His wife, Ann Putnam SR, was one of the most active accusers. His daughter, young Ann Putnam Jr., was one of the original afflicted girls. His servant, Mercy Lewis, named names from inside his house. The Putnam family sat at the center of the accusations, like a spider at the center of a web. Upham started mapping the land. He pulled old deeds. He traced property lines. He found that many of the people the Putnams accused owned land that bordered Putnam land, or land that the Putnams had once claimed, or land that was tied up in old inheritance disputes going back decades. The fog started to lift. Thomas Putnam's father had been one of the wealthiest men in Salem Village. But when the old man died, he left most of his estate to a son from his second wife. Thomas got less than he expected. That wound never healed. The Putnam family spent years fighting over land, over inheritance, over what they believed was rightfully theirs. And then the trials began. Upham found that the accused were not random. They were not simply the strange ones, the lonely ones, the women who talked too loud or prayed too little. Many of them had something the Putnams wanted: land on the western side of the village, orchards, pastures, timber rights along the creek. Rebecca Nurse, one of the most beloved women in Salem, was accused by the Putnam family. Her land sat right where the Putnams wanted to expand. She was 71 years old. She was nearly deaf. She had grandchildren who adored her. The jury found her not guilty on the first vote. Then the judges sent the jury back to reconsider, they came back with a different answer. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on a warm July morning in 1692. Upham wrote it all down. He published his findings in 1867, a book called Salem Witchcraft. It was dense. It was long. It was full of footnotes and land surveys and old court documents. It was not a comfortable read, but it laid out the case in plain terms. The accusations followed property lines. The Putnam family stood at the center, and the court that heard the cases was staffed by men who were, in many cases, connected to the same land disputes. Nobody wanted to believe it. Salem had spent 2 centuries telling itself a different story. The trials were a tragedy, yes, a moment of mass hysteria. Good people caught up in fear and superstition. A lesson about the dangers of religious extremism. That story was painful, but it was clean. It didn't require anyone to look too hard at their own ancestors. Upham's story was not clean. It said that some of the people who drove the accusations knew exactly what they were doing. It said that the girls who screamed and fell and pointed fingers may have been used, not by the devil, by men with deeds in their coat pockets and debts they wanted settled. Upham died in 1875. He never saw his work taken seriously by the wider world, but he left the documents behind. He left the maps. He left the names lined up next to each other like stones along a fence. And eventually, other people started looking. They found what he found. They found more. The land records were still there, sitting in county archives, quiet as old snow, waiting for someone patient enough to read them. The story they told was not about the devil at all. Picture a quiet morning in Salem Village. The air is cold and still. Frost clings to the window glass like white lace. A woman wakes up, feeds her children, tends her fire. She is ordinary. She is known. She has lived among these people her whole life. Then someone points. And just like that, everything she owns stops being hers. That is what the accusation did. It didn't just put you in danger. It reached into your house and took things. Your cattle, your furniture, your land. The sheriff came with a cart and hauled it all away before the trial even started. The law said your property had to be held, while the court decided your fate. But held is a gentle word for what actually happened. Mary Easty knew this. She was a grandmother, a church-going woman. Her neighbors had known her for decades. When they came for her in April of 1692, she didn't rage or beg. She wrote a letter, not to save herself. She knew by then that saving herself wasn't possible. She wrote it to save the people who would come after her. She asked the court to stop using the kind of testimony that had condemned her. She asked them to think about what they were doing. She was hanged on September 22nd. Her letter survived her. Her sister Rebecca Nurse had already been hanged by then. The two of them, sisters, both gone. Their family didn't get the land back for years. Philip English was a merchant, a wealthy one. He owned ships and warehouses, and a fine house on Essex Street in Salem town. When the accusations came for him and his wife Mary, they ran. They escaped to New York with help from friends. It was the smart thing to do. But while they were gone, the sheriff cleaned out everything they had. Goods from the warehouse, furniture from the house, livestock. Philip English spent the rest of his life trying to get it back. He never fully did. He died bitter and hollowed out, a man who had once been one of the most prosperous people in the colony. Anne Foster was 70 years old when they accused her. 70. She confessed, because confession was the only thing that kept you alive. She sat in jail for months. The jail in Salem was not a place built for comfort. It was cold and dark and damp, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. Anne Foster died in that jail before they ever brought her to trial. Her family had to pay for her imprisonment before they could claim her body. That was the rule. You paid for the privilege of being locked up. You paid for the chains. You paid for the food, such as it was. And if you died before the court finished with you, your family paid to take you home. John Proctor saw it clearly from the start. He called the whole thing a fraud. He said so out loud, which was brave and also unwise. When they came for his wife Elizabeth, he went to court to defend her. So they accused him too. He wrote a letter to the ministers of Boston, asking them to move the trials to a different court, away from Salem, away from the people who seemed to have already made up their minds. The letter didn't work. He was hanged in August. His wife survived because she was pregnant, and they wouldn't execute a woman carrying a child. But the sheriff had already come to the house. He took their cattle. He took their food. He left their children with almost nothing to eat that winter. These weren't strangers to each other. That is the part that stays with you when you sit with these stories long enough. These were neighbors. People who had borrowed tools from each other, helped each other bring in harvests, sat together in the same cold church on winter Sundays. And then one season, one terrible season, some of them pointed at the others, and the whole world changed. The ones who got pointed at lost everything in layers. First their freedom, then their property, then their reputation, then, for 19 of them, their lives. And even after the trials ended, even after the colony admitted it had made a terrible mistake, getting any of it back was slow and incomplete and sometimes impossible. Mary Eastie's letter is still in the archives. You can read it today. Her handwriting is careful and even. She sounds like someone who has made peace with what is coming. She just wanted to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. It did, of course, but she tried. The court opened in June of 1692. It had a name that sounded official and serious. The Court of Oyer and Terminer. That's an old French phrase. It means to hear and to determine. But the people who walked through its doors that summer learned something fast. The hearing part was mostly for show. The determining had already been done. The court was built in a hurry. Governor William Phips signed it into existence in late May. He appointed 9 judges to run it. 8 of those 9 judges were men with deep ties to Salem town. Men with property. Men with business interests. Men who knew the accusers personally and had known them for years. You could walk the streets of Salem town and find the connections everywhere, like threads in an old piece of cloth. The chief judge was William Stoughton. He was a hard man, thin-lipped and certain. He believed the devil was real and present and active in Massachusetts, and he believed the court's job was to root him out. Stoughton had no legal training. He had a theology degree from Oxford. he came to that courtroom not as a lawyer, but as a man of God on a mission. And that made him more dangerous than any lawyer could have been. The rules inside that courtroom were not like any rules you'd recognize today. The accused could not have a lawyer speak for them. They stood alone. They faced their accusers directly. The girls would point and weep and fall to the floor, and the judges would look at the accused and ask why they were tormenting these children, not whether, why, that word matters. Why, not did you do this? Why are you doing this? The guilt was already assumed. The only question left was whether you'd confess to it. And here is where the shape starts to form. Here is where the dates and the names and the places begin to line up in a way that's hard to explain as accident. When an accused person confessed, they lived. When they refused to confess, they died. That was the pattern, clean and simple. Confess and survive. Deny and hang. And when you confessed, you were expected to name others. The court needed more names. It always needed more names. So every confession fed the next arrest, and every arrest fed the next confession, and the whole thing moved forward like a wheel that couldn't stop turning. Stoughton pushed hard for confessions. He believed a confession was proof of God's grace working on a sinner's soul. He believed the court was doing holy work. But there was something else happening inside those confession chambers, something quieter and more practical. When you confessed, you stayed in jail. Your property stayed attached to your name. It couldn't be seized while you were still alive and still technically a landowner. But when you were convicted and hanged, the law had things to say about what happened to everything you owned. The property question hung over that courtroom like smoke over a wet fire. It never quite cleared. Look at the geography of the accused. Draw a rough map. Put a mark where each accused person lived. Put another mark where their accusers lived. Then put a third mark where the judges and court officials owned land or held debts. The marks cluster. They overlap. The same neighborhoods appear again and again. The same property boundaries show up in the court records and in the land deed records sitting in the same county office. This is not a coincidence that one person noticed. Historians have gone back through those records with careful eyes and found the same thing over and over. The accused were not random. They were concentrated in specific areas of Salem Village, areas that sat along contested property lines, areas where ownership had been disputed for years before a single girl ever had a fit. The court heard over 150 cases that summer and fall. It convicted 29 people. 19 were hanged. One was pressed to death under stones. The rest died in jail or were eventually released when the whole thing finally collapsed under its own weight. But in those months, when the court was running at full speed, it moved fast. Cases that would take weeks in any normal proceeding were decided in days. Witnesses were heard and dismissed. Confessions were taken at odd hours. Judges conferred privately. The machinery of it had a rhythm, almost like it had been rehearsed. Stoughton signed every death warrant himself. He never expressed doubt. Not once, not publicly, not in any letter or record that survived. He believed he was right. And that certainty, that absolute unshaking certainty, is the most frightening thing about him. There is a kind of guilt that cannot be disproven. That was the genius of it, and the terror. In the Salem courtroom of 1692, a new kind of evidence took the stand. They called it spectral evidence. The idea was simple, and it was devastating. If a person claimed that your spirit had visited them in the night, had pinched them or choked them, or whispered dark things into their ear, that was enough. You could be standing in your kitchen when it happened. You could be asleep in your bed. It didn't matter. Your specter, your invisible double, had done the deed. And you were responsible for what your specter did. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as a legal theory, as a lived experience. You are a farmer. You have a wife, children, a small plot of land your father left you. One morning, a neighbor's daughter wakes up screaming. She says she saw you in her room. She says your ghost sat on her chest and pressed the air from her lungs. She says your eyes were black and your hands were cold. You were not there. You have no way to prove you were not there. Nobody does. The specter leaves no footprints. It casts no shadow. It cannot be caught or measured or held up to the light. The court accepted this fully, without hesitation. Cotton Mather, one of the most powerful ministers in Massachusetts, had written about the invisible world. He believed the devil could take the shape of an innocent person. He believed spirits moved through walls and across miles of dark forest. And so the court believed it too. If the afflicted girls cried out, if they fell to the floor and shook, if they pointed a trembling finger at someone across the room, that was testimony. That was evidence. That was, in the eyes of the court, as good as a signed confession. The accused had no real defense. Saying you were innocent meant nothing. Saying you were home, asleep, miles away meant nothing. Some tried to argue that the devil could take any shape he pleased, even the shape of a good Christian. And so the specter proved nothing about the person. A few ministers quietly agreed, but the court pressed on. The judges had made their decision before the trials began. The evidence existed to confirm what they already believed. What made spectral evidence so powerful was that it lived entirely inside the mind of the accuser. It was a closed loop. The more you denied it, the more the afflicted girls suffered. Their suffering was the proof. Your denial was the crime. There is something almost dreamlike about how this worked. The courtroom would go quiet. Then one of the girls would gasp. She would clutch her arm, her throat, her face. She would say she felt it now, right now. The accused was sending their specter into the room this very moment. The other girls would follow. They would cry out together, a chorus of pain that filled the wooden room with sound. The judges would look at the accused. The accused would stand there, helpless, watching their own life dissolve. Some of the accused wept. Some prayed. Some fainted. One woman, it was said, laughed, and that laughter was taken as further proof of her guilt. There was no correct way to respond. Every reaction fit the story the court had already written. The fog of it was deliberate. A clear, provable accusation could be challenged. A witness could be questioned. A timeline could be checked. But spectral evidence floated above all of that. It existed in a space where logic couldn't follow. And in that space, the court could do whatever it wanted. By summer, the jail in Salem was crowded past its walls. Men and women sat in chains in the heat, waiting. Some had been there for months. The The smell of the place, damp stone and unwashed bodies, and the sour edge of fear hung over the town like weather. Outside, the fields needed tending. The crops were going dry, but the court kept meeting, and the girls kept crying out, and the list of the accused kept growing. Every name on that list had land. Every name had something to lose. And the spectral evidence made sure they would lose it, cleanly, legally, with the full weight of God and government behind the taking. The invisible world was a perfect weapon. It left no marks. It kept no records. It only ever pointed one direction. And nobody, not yet, had found a way to make it stop. There are moments in history that stop you cold. Not because they're strange, because they're too clean, too neat, like someone knew exactly what was coming before it arrived. This is one of those moments. The year is 1692. The accusations are flying. Salem Village is a place of fear and whispered names. Every morning brings new arrests. Every week, the jails fill a little more. To the people living through it, the whole thing feels like chaos, like a fire that caught and spread, and no one could stop it. But here is the detail that doesn't fit. In some cases, the paperwork came before the arrest. The land transfer, the deed, the legal document that moved a piece of property from one owner to another. Signed, witnessed, recorded. And then, days later, sometimes only hours later, the person who used to own that land was named as a witch. Sit with that for a moment. In Puritan New England, land was everything. It wasn't just wealth. It was survival. It was your family's future. It was the ground your children would farm and the soil your grandchildren would be buried in. You didn't give it up easily. You didn't sign it away unless something forced your hand. And yet here were people signing over property and then almost immediately being dragged into court on charges of witchcraft. The name that comes up most often in this pattern is Giles Corey. He was an old farmer, rough, stubborn, the kind of man who had worked the same land for decades and knew every stone of it. His wife Martha was accused early in the trials, and Giles himself would eventually be pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. But before any of that happened, there were questions about his land. were neighbors who wanted it. There were disputes that had simmered for years, like a pot left too long on the fire. And the timing of what happened to Giles and Martha, when you lay it against the property records, starts to look less like divine judgment and more like something planned. Martha Corey was one of the first respectable women accused. Before her, the accused had been easy targets. Outsiders, the poor, the strange. Martha was a church member, a known face. Her accusation changed everything. It said that no one was safe, but it also quietly put the Corey land into a very uncertain legal position. There is another name, Philip English. He was one of the wealthiest men in Salem town, a merchant. He owned ships and warehouses and more property than almost anyone in the region. When he and his wife Mary were accused, they managed to escape to New York. They survived, but when they came back, much of what they had owned was gone, seized, sold, transferred to other hands while they were away. Philip English spent years trying to get it back. He never fully did. The detail that sits at the center of all this is simple and strange. In a court system that claimed to be hunting the devil's servants kept losing their land to the same small group of men. The same names appear again and again in the property records. The same families, the same neighbors, the same men who sat on committees and signed documents and helped run the machinery of the trials. It could be coincidence. History is full of coincidence. But there is a specific deed recorded in Essex County that researchers have pointed to for years. A piece of land changed hands. The ink was barely dry, and within a week, the former owner was named in a complaint. The complaint led to an arrest. The arrest led to a trial. The trial led to a death. The land stayed where it had gone. No one ever gave it back. That is the detail that doesn't fit the story of a town gone mad with fear. Fear is messy. Fear makes mistakes. Fear accuses the wrong people and then corrects itself and then spirals again. Fear doesn't file paperwork in the right order, but greed does. Greed is patient. Greed plans ahead. Greed knows which name to whisper and when to whisper it. Greed understands that a dead man can't contest a deed, and a hanged woman can't walk back into court and reclaim her farm. The trials looked like chaos from the outside. From the inside, for a few careful men, they may have looked like something else entirely. They may have looked like an opportunity. And someone, it seems, took it. Not everyone believed it. Even in 1692, even in a town soaked in fear and scripture, there were people who looked at the accusations and felt something cold settle in their chests. Not the cold of dread, the cold of suspicion, the kind that comes when a story is too convenient. These were the skeptics, and they didn't disappear quietly. Thomas Brattle was one of them. He was a merchant, a mathematician, a man who dealt in numbers and facts. He watched the court of Oyer and Terminer work through the summer of 1692, and what he saw made him write a letter. A long, careful, furious letter. He sent it in October of that year. In it, he called the court's methods a disgrace. He said the judges had been fooled. He said the evidence was worthless. He named names and made arguments, and he did it all in plain, steady language that still reads like cold water on a hot stone. Brattle wasn't alone. Robert Califf was another. He spent years collecting testimony, interviewing witnesses, tracking the shape of what had happened. He published a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World. The title was a dig at Cotton Mather, who had written his own book defending the trials. Califf's book made people angry. Cotton Mather's father, Increase Mather, reportedly had a copy burned. That's how much it stung. These men made a simple argument. They said, look at who was accused. Look at where they lived. Look at what they owned. The pattern isn't spiritual. The pattern is geographical, and they were right to say it. When you lay the accusations over a map of Salem Village, something strange appears. The people who cried witch tended to live in the western part of the village. The people they accused tended to live in the eastern part. The western side was poorer, more rural, more dependent on farming. The eastern side had more access to the port, more ties to Salem town, more money moving through it. The line between accusers and accused wasn't drawn by the devil. It was drawn by property lines and old grudges and the slow burn of economic envy. The skeptics point to this and say, there's your answer. It wasn't theology. It was real estate. And for a long time, that argument feels airtight. But then you sit with it a little longer, and a crack appears. Because if this was purely a land grab, purely a calculated scheme to steal property from neighbors, then the people running it were extraordinarily good at hiding their tracks. The deed transfers, the property grabs, the quiet acquisitions after an execution, those happened. We have the records, but the people who benefited most weren't always the ones who made the accusations. Sometimes the accusers gained nothing. Sometimes they lost neighbors they'd known for 30 years and got no land in return. Sometimes the accused had almost nothing worth taking. That's the gap the skeptics can't fully close. A pure conspiracy needs clear winners, and Salem's winners were scattered and inconsistent. Some accusers profited, some didn't. Some of the accused were wealthy, some were nearly destitute. The pattern is real, but it's ragged. It doesn't have the clean edges of a plan drawn up in a back room. So the skeptics go quiet for a moment, not because they're wrong, but because the truth seems to be something messier than either side wants to admit. What if it was both things at once? What if genuine fear lived right next to genuine greed? What if some people in Salem truly believed the devil was walking their fields, and other people looked at that fear and thought, I can use this? What if the hysteria was real, and the exploitation of it was also real, and the two things fed each other until nobody could tell them apart anymore? That's the hardest kind of history to hold. The kind where the villains aren't purely villainous and the victims aren't purely innocent, and the truth sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Thomas Brattle knew something was wrong. Robert Califf knew something was wrong. They were brave men for saying so, but even they couldn't see the whole shape of it. They could see the property lines. They could see the pattern. What they couldn't see was the fear underneath it, old and dark and genuine, that gave the whole machine its power. You can follow the property lines all the way to the edge of the map. And when you get there, you'll find something the lines can't explain. Something that was never written down. Something that lived in the spaces between the deeds and the accusations and the names of the dead. Some people looked at Salem in 1692 and saw exactly what they were told to see. A town under siege, the devil walking among good Christian people, a crisis of faith that demanded swift and terrible action. These people believed, or at least they acted like they did. And when the hangings stopped, when the courts went quiet and the jails emptied out, you can trace a line from the gallows straight to their front doors. That line leads to land. Thomas Putnam was not a subtle man. He filed more complaints than almost anyone in Salem Village. His daughter Anne was one of the first afflicted girls. His wife joined in. His neighbors, his allies, his extended family, they all pointed fingers in the same general direction. And if you lay a map of those accusations over a map of Salem Village property lines, something becomes very clear. The Putnam family wanted more land. They had wanted it for years. The trials gave them a way to get it. When a man was accused of witchcraft, his property didn't automatically transfer to his accusers. The law was more careful than that. But land disputes that had dragged on for years suddenly resolved themselves. Neighbors who had blocked the Putnams from expanding their holdings were arrested, tried, and hanged. Their families scattered. Their farms sat empty, and the people who had accused them were right there, ready to step in. This is not speculation. Historians have gone through the deeds. They've read the wills. They've followed the money through probate records and town meeting minutes. The pattern holds up. The people who accused the most tended to gain the most. Not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it was a fence line moved a few yards. Sometimes it was a debt forgiven because the man who held the note was now dead. Small gains, quiet gains, the kind that don't draw attention. Philip English was one of the wealthiest men in Salem town. He was a merchant, a ship owner, a man with warehouses full of imported goods. He and his wife Mary were both accused. They fled to New York before they could be hanged. When they came back, after the madness had passed, they found their property picked over, goods taken, warehouses emptied. Philip English spent years trying to recover what was stolen from him. He never fully did. Someone else was living better because of what happened to him. The Nurse family knew what they were watching. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when they hanged her. She was a grandmother. She was beloved by her congregation. She had lived a quiet, faithful life on a farm her family had fought for years to hold on to. That farm sat right in the middle of a long-running dispute with the Putnam family. Rebecca's children knew it. They said so. They stood up in court and said their mother was innocent and that the accusations were rooted in old grudges over property. Nobody listened. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on Gallows Hill on a hot July morning in 1692. Her farm stayed in the Nurse family. That part of the story has a different ending. Her children held on. They fought back. They are part of why we know what we know today. But Rebecca was still dead. The people who believed in the trials, who pushed them forward, who kept the accusations flowing through the summer and into the fall, they were not all cynics. Some of them were true believers. Some of them genuinely thought the devil had come to Salem. Fear is real. Hysteria is real. You cannot explain 1692 with greed alone. But greed was there, sitting right next to the fear, wearing the same face. The Reverend Samuel Parris, whose own household started the whole thing, left Salem in 1697. He was driven out by his own congregation. Before he left, he tried to keep the deed to the parsonage, the house the church owned, the house he had been given to live in as minister, not to own. He fought for that deed for months. Even at the end, even after everything, he was thinking about property. He lost that fight. The congregation took the deed back. There is something almost small about that detail. All those lives, all that suffering, 19 people hanged, one man pressed under stones, hundreds accused, and one of the men at the center of it all spent his last days in Salem arguing over a house deed. The land was always there, underneath everything, underneath the prayers and the fear and the testimony and the tears. The land was what people wanted. The land was what people got. There is a piece of land in Danvers, Massachusetts, that nobody builds on. It sits quiet at the edge of what used to be Salem Village. The soil there is dark and soft, even in dry summers. Trees grow at odd angles, leaning away from the center like they want nothing to do with whatever is underneath. Locals have known about this patch of ground for a long time. They don't talk about it much. They just leave it alone. This is where Samuel Parris once lived. His house stood here. His church stood here. His daughter Betty and his niece Abigail played here in the cold months of 1692, right before everything broke open. The foundation is long gone. The wood rotted away centuries ago, but the ground remembers the shape of what stood on it, the way old skin remembers a scar. Samuel Parris came to Salem Village in 1689. He was a failed merchant who turned to preaching when the trading life didn't work out. He was not a gentle man. He preached about enemies. He preached about betrayal. He saw the devil in small disagreements and personal slights. His sermons were fire and accusation, week after week, winter after winter. And he had land on his mind. When Parris took the job in Salem Village, the congregation promised him the use of the parsonage and the land around it, but they never gave him the deed. The house was his to live in. The land was his to farm, but it wasn't his to own, not on paper. Not in the way that mattered. This bothered him deeply. He asked for the deed. He was told to wait. He asked again. The village was divided about him, the way it was divided about everything. Half the congregation loved him. Half wanted him gone. The men who controlled the land were mostly in that second half. Then the girls started having fits. Then the accusations started. And then, one by one, the people who had opposed Samuel Parris in church meetings began to find themselves named as witches. This is not a coincidence that historians invented. It is written in the original records, plain as anything. The men who voted against Parris, who refused to give him his deed, who sat on the wrong side of the aisle, their wives and sisters and neighbors ended up in chains. Some of them ended up on Gallows Hill. After the trials ended, Parris did not stay long. The village turned on him. They had seen what happened, or at least they felt the shape of it, even if they couldn't say it plainly. He was asked to leave. He left in 1696. He never got the deed. But here is what stays with you about the land itself. The parsonage site has been excavated more than once by historians and archaeologists. They found the foundation stones. They found pottery shards and old nails, and the dark stain in the earth where the hearth once burned. They found the outline of a root cellar where food was stored through long winters. And they found something else. The soil in and around that cellar showed signs of unusual disturbance. Layers that should have been undisturbed were mixed together, turned over, like the ground had been dug and filled and dug again. Nobody knows exactly why. The records don't say. But people who study this place have noted it for years. The river near the old village boundary shifted course sometime in the 18th century. Not dramatically, just enough. Old maps show it running one way. Later maps show it running slightly different. Rivers do this on their own sometimes. But the shift moved the boundary line of several properties that had been disputed during the trial years. The land that had been fought over quietly ended up on a different side of the water. Animals behave strangely near the old execution site too. This is not a ghost story. It is just something that people who live near Gallows Hill have reported for generations. Dogs won't go to the top of the hill at night. Horses used to balk at the road that ran past it. Whether that means anything is up to you. What it means to the people who have lived near these places for generations is simpler than any theory. The land holds what happened. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't judge it. It just holds it, the way cold stone holds the memory of heat long after the fire goes out. Samuel Parris left. The land stayed. And the land, as it turns out, has a longer memory than any man who ever tried to own it. There is a question that doesn't get asked enough about Salem. Not who was accused, not who died, but who was never touched at all. Stand back from the names on those arrest warrants. Look at the spaces between them. Look at the families who lived right next door to the accused, who attended the same church, who drew water from the same wells, and who somehow walked through 1692 without a single finger pointed in their direction. That silence is loud. That safety is suspicious. The Porter family lived in Salem Village. They were prosperous. They owned good land along the Ipswich River, land with rich, dark soil that held water well and grew crops heavy on the stock. The Porters had money. They had connections. They had relatives in Salem town, the merchant side of things, the side with ships and warehouses and political weight. And when the accusations started flying like sparks off a grinding wheel, the Porters stood untouched. Not one member of that family was named. Not one. Now look at who the Porters didn't get along with. The Putnams. The same Putnams whose daughter Anne pointed her shaking finger at half the village. The same Putnams whose patriarch Thomas filed more complaints than almost any other man in Salem. The Putnams and the Porters had been fighting over land boundaries and local power for years before any of this started. And yet somehow, in all that chaos, the Porters never ended up on a list. You can call that luck. Some people do. This pattern didn't belong only to Salem. It showed up in other places, in other centuries, wearing different clothes, but carrying the same shape underneath. In the 1830s, a small farming community in western Pennsylvania went through what locals called a witch scare. It never made the history books. It was too small, too local, too easy to forget. But the story passed down through families in that county tells of a handful of accusations, a handful of ruined households, and a handful of families who came out of it owning land they hadn't owned before. The families who accused, the families who testified, the families who walked away clean. The records from that county show land transfers in the years right after the Trouble, quiet sales, below market value, families who had lost a member to accusation, who had spent everything on legal fees and fines, selling off parcels just to survive. And the buyers were almost always neighbors, almost always neighbors who had been present at the hearings, almost always neighbors who had said the right things to the right people. Nobody called it a land grab at the time. They called it misfortune. They called it God's will. They called it the natural order of things. Out in the Ohio Valley, in the years before the Civil War, similar stories collected in the corners of county histories. A man accused of strange dealings with a neighbor's livestock. His farm sold at auction within a year. The buyer, a deacon in the local church. The deacon who had first raised the complaint. These stories don't have the drama of Salem. There were no hangings, no famous judges, no court records that scholars would later study by candlelight. But the shape of the thing was the same. There is an old pattern in American life. It goes like this. Someone wants what you have. They cannot simply take it. The law won't allow that, or at least it makes things complicated. So they find another way. They find a reason that sounds bigger than greed. They find a language that makes the taking feel righteous. Religion worked well for this in the 1600s. Fear of the outsider worked well in other eras. Fear of the different, the strange, the one who doesn't quite fit. The accusation is just the tool. The land is always the point. Back in Salem, the families who were never accused shared certain things. They had allies in positions of power. They had legal knowledge or access to it. They had debts owed to them rather than debts they owed. They had, in short, the kind of protection that money and connection quietly provide. The families who were accused shared certain things too. Boundary disputes, outstanding debts, land that someone else wanted, a position on the wrong side of a political argument that had been simmering for years before anyone started talking about the devil. The girls in that parsonage shook and cried and pointed, but someone had to decide which direction their fingers would point. Someone had to make sure those fingers never turned toward the wrong family. That someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they never lost a single acre. There are things that survived the year 1692, not just stories passed down through families, not just names carved into stone. Actual paper, actual ink, documents that sat in boxes and courthouse drawers for 300 years. And when someone finally opened those boxes, the papers told a very specific story. The confession records are the strangest of all. When the court at Salem was running at full speed, there were two kinds of people who came before it. Those who said they were innocent, and those who said they were guilty. The ones who said they were innocent almost always hanged. The ones who said they were guilty almost always walked free. Think about that for a moment. The court let the guilty ones go home. 50 people confessed to witchcraft during the Salem trials. 50. And not a single one of them was executed. The court needed confessors. A confession meant the devil was real. The threat was real. The court's work was real. A confession fed the machine. So the machine protected confessors. What the records show, when you lay them out side by side, is something quieter and more unsettling than any courtroom drama. The people who confessed tended to keep their land. The people who refused to confess, who stood firm and said, "I am innocent before God," those people lost everything. Their property was seized while they sat in jail. Their families scattered. Their names were used to pull in the next round of accusations. The paper trail is right there. You can hold it. The Essex County Court records still exist. Hundreds of pages of them. Warrants, depositions, property transfers, estate inventories. Historians have spent decades going through them, and what they found is a pattern so consistent it stops feeling like coincidence somewhere around the 30th case. Mary Osgood confessed. Her land stayed in her family. Anne Foster confessed. Her property was not seized. Rebecca Nurse refused to confess. She was hanged on Gallows Hill in July of 1692, and her family spent years trying to get her name cleared and her estate restored. The contrast is not subtle. It is written in the margins of the same documents, in the same handwriting, filed in the same courthouse. There is one document in particular that historians keep coming back to. It is a land transfer record dated just days after a confession was signed. The accused had confessed, named a few neighbors as fellow witches, and within the week, a parcel of land that had been disputed for years was quietly transferred to a new owner. The accused walked free. The land moved. The neighbors who had been named were now facing their own legal troubles and had no time to fight a property dispute. The document is faded now. The ink has gone brown at the edges, but the words are still legible. The dates are still clear, and the names on that land transfer are the same names that appear in the accusation records, just on the other side of the ledger. You can see the original confession documents at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. Some of them are on display behind glass. The handwriting is careful and small. The letters pressed hard into the page, like whoever was writing wanted the words to last. And they did last. 300 years and counting. What strikes people who see them in person is how ordinary they look. No dramatic flourish. No wild claims about flying through the night sky or dancing with the devil in the meadow. Just plain statements. I confess. I was deceived. I repent. And then a signature or a mark, because not everyone could write their own name. Some of those marks are just an a single cross on a page that determined whether a family kept their home or lost it. There are also the letters, private correspondence that survived in attic trunks and family collections. Letters written during the trials that mention the accusations in passing, the way you might mention bad weather. One letter written by a merchant in Boston to a business partner in England notes that the trouble in Salem Village is making it difficult to settle certain debts, because so many of the men involved in the disputes are now either in jail or sitting on the court. He doesn't seem alarmed. He seems annoyed. Like this is an inconvenience to commerce, not a tragedy of justice. That letter is in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. You can request to see it. The paper survived. The ink survived. And what they say, quietly and without drama, is that someone in Salem knew exactly what a confession was worth. Not in heaven, on the ground, in acres. People were hanged on Gallows Hill. One man was pressed to death under stones. Those numbers are small enough to hold in your hands, but behind each one is a family, and families remember. The stories passed down through Salem's bloodlines don't always match the court records. They've been smoothed and shaped by 100 years of telling. A grandmother softens one part. A grandfather adds a detail nobody can verify. By the time the story reaches you, it's half memory and half myth. But the grief underneath it never changed. Take the nurses. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when they hanged her. She was a grandmother. She had grandchildren who watched her go. Her family fought for her harder than almost anyone fought for anyone during those months. They gathered signatures. They wrote letters. They stood in the meeting house and said plainly that this woman was innocent. It didn't matter. The court had already made up its mind. After she was gone, her family carried that wound for generations. buried her quietly on their own land, away from the shame of the official burial ground. They kept her memory close like a candle in a dark room. More than 300 years later, her descendants still gather at the Rebecca Nurse homestead. They still say her name out loud. That's what it looks like when a family refuses to let the ground swallow someone whole. Then there's Giles Corey. He was 80 years old. They accused him of witchcraft in the spring of 1692. But Giles refused to enter a plea. He wouldn't say guilty. He wouldn't say not guilty. He just stood there, silent as a stone wall in winter. The law at the time said a man who refused to plead could be pressed. They laid him in a field. They stacked heavy rocks on his chest, one by one, to force a plea out of him. He lasted 2 days. His last words, by most accounts, were more weight. That story has been told at kitchen tables in Essex County for 3 centuries. The details shift a little each time. Some versions say he cursed the sheriff as he died. Some say he smiled, but the core of it never moves. An old man chose to die rather than give the court what it wanted. And his family never forgot that. His wife, Martha, had already been condemned. She was hanged 8 days after he died. They were buried in the same season, in the same silence. Their children inherited a farm and a story that sat heavy as those stones. The Proctors were another family split open by that year. John Proctor was hanged in August. His wife, Elizabeth, was pregnant, so they delayed her execution. By the time the trials collapsed, she was still alive. She walked out of prison and back into a world that had taken her husband, seized her property, and left her with almost nothing. She rebuilt. She remarried. She kept going. But her children grew up knowing what Salem had done to their father. These are the stories that shaped the town's memory more than any court document ever could. A legal record tells you what was charged and what was decided. A family story tells you what it felt like to stand in the yard and watch them take your mother away. Those are different kinds of truth. Some families went quiet about it. The shame of being connected to the trials, whether as accused or accuser, made people want to close the door and walk away. There are descendants of the accusers who didn't learn the full story until they were adults. There are descendants of the accused who kept the grief so private it almost disappeared. But it never fully disappeared. It lived in the names people gave their children. It lived in the way certain families avoided certain other families at church for decades. It lived in the land itself, in the property lines that had shifted, and the farms that had changed hands under strange circumstances. Salem is a small place. It was even smaller in 1692. Everyone knew everyone. When 19 of your neighbors were hanged and one was pressed to death, you didn't forget. You couldn't. The town was too tight, the streets too narrow, the meeting house too close. The grief had nowhere to go but inward, and inward is where it stayed. The family stories are the part of this history that no deed or court record can fully capture. They are the part that breathes. They are the part that walks into a room 300 years later and sits down at the table like it never left. There comes a point in every storm when the wind simply stops. Not slowly, not with warning. It just stops. The air goes still. The trees stop shaking. And you stand there in the sudden quiet, wondering how something so loud could end so fast. That's what happened in Salem in the autumn of 1692. The trials had been running since the spring. The court had hanged 19 people. One man had been pressed under heavy stones until his chest gave out. Hundreds more sat in jail, waiting. The whole machine was still turning. And then, almost without explanation, it stopped. The question people have been asking ever since is simple. What changed? Part of it was the accusations themselves. By the fall, the circle of names had grown so wide it no longer made sense. The afflicted girls weren't just pointing at poor old women on the edge of town anymore. They were pointing at ministers, at merchants, at people with money and standing and friends in Boston. They pointed at the wife of the governor himself, Lady Phipps. And that was the moment the powerful men of Massachusetts looked at each other and understood that no one was safe. When the poor get accused, the rich can watch from a distance. When the rich get accused, the distance disappears. Governor William Phipps had been the one who created the special court in the first place. He'd handed it the power to try witchcraft cases. and then gone off to fight a war in the north. When he came back and found his own wife's name in the records, something shifted in him. He wrote to London. He asked for guidance. And while he waited, he quietly stopped signing death warrants. The court held one more session in September. It convicted 8 more people. Phipps refused to execute them. He let them sit in jail instead, which wasn't mercy exactly, but it was a pause. And sometimes a pause is enough. Cotton Mather, the minister who had done so much to keep the fire burning, preached a sermon that fall trying to hold the line. He still believed, or at least he said he did. He stood at the gallows when George Burroughs was hanged and told the crowd not to waver. But the crowd was already wavering. You could feel it in the way people looked at each other. The certainty was cracking. Thomas Brattle was a Boston merchant and a man of science. He'd watched the trials from the beginning with growing unease. In October of 1692, he wrote a long letter. He didn't publish it. He just sent it to friends. But the letter spread. In it, he laid out everything that troubled him. The spectral evidence, the way the court accepted the visions of young girls as proof of guilt, the way confessing saved you while denying the charges got you killed. He called it a tragedy. He called it a mistake. He wrote it plainly and without cruelty, and people read it and felt something loosen in their chests. By January of 1693, Governor Phipps had dissolved the special court entirely. He replaced it with a new court that would not accept spectral evidence. Of the remaining accused, nearly all were acquitted. The ones still convicted were pardoned. The jails slowly emptied. The town came back to itself, the way a person wakes from a fever. Slowly, with confusion, with a kind of shame that doesn't have a name yet. The families of the dead were still there. They still lived next to the families of the accusers. They still sat in the same church. They still passed each other on the same dirt roads between the same wooden houses. The fields were the same fields. The sky was the same cold Massachusetts sky, pale and wide and indifferent. But something had broken that couldn't be fixed by dissolving a court. The land disputes didn't disappear. The grudges didn't disappear. The memory of who had pointed and who had hanged and who had walked away with a deed in their pocket that didn't disappear either. It just went quiet. It went underground, the way roots go underground in winter, still alive, still spreading, just hidden from view. Salem Village renamed itself Danvers in 1752. Some people say that was practical. Some people say it was an attempt to leave the name behind. Either way, the ground didn't change. The old property lines were still there, drawn in the same places, owned by the same families who had survived. The storm had passed, but the town it left behind was not the same town that the storm had found. Imagine you are standing in Salem Village on a cold October night. Not today's Salem, with its gift shops and ghost tour and orange lights strung up for the tourists. The old Salem, the one that existed before anyone thought to make money from the story. The ground is hard under your feet. The frost came early this year. It always does out here, in this flat stretch of Massachusetts, where the trees grow close, and the wind comes off the water with a bite that feels personal. The sky above you is enormous. Out here, away from the lights of town, you can see every star. They go all the way down to the horizon in every direction. The sky feels less like a ceiling and more like something you could fall into. The fields around you are quiet. A branch cracks somewhere in the dark. A bird shifts in the brush. Then nothing again. Just the wind moving through the dry grass, slow and steady, like the land is breathing. This is where it happened. Right here. On ground like this, under a sky like this, in weather exactly like this, and for almost 200 years, nobody looked too closely at the paperwork. The court records from 1692 sat in archives. The deeds sat in county offices. The land surveys sat in folders that nobody opened unless they had a reason to. The story everyone told was about religion and fear, and the devil walking through a Puritan village. That story was easier. It had a shape people recognized. It didn't require anyone to look at a map. Then, in the 20th century, a few researchers started looking at the map. A historian named Paul Boyer and a sociologist named Stephen Nissenbaum spent years going through those old records. They published their findings in 1974 in a book called Salem possessed. What they found was not a mystery of the supernatural. It was a mystery of property lines. When they laid the accusations over a map of the village, a shape appeared. The people who accused others lived mostly on the western side of the village, the farming side, the side that felt left behind by the growing merchant economy of Salem town. The people who got accused lived mostly on the eastern side, closer to the port, closer to the money, closer to the future that was leaving the farmers behind. The pattern was not perfect. Patterns like this never are, but it was there, clear enough to see once you knew to look for it. And then there was Thomas Putnam. His name had come up before. It comes up again here because the records kept pointing back to him. He filed more legal complaints during the trials than almost anyone else. His daughter Anne was one of the original accusers. His wife joined in. His extended family filled the witness lists. And when you traced the land that changed hands after the executions, Putnam's circle kept appearing near the edges of it. He didn't get everything he wanted. History is rarely that clean, but he got enough. And the people who stood in his way ended up in court, or in jail, or on Gallows Hill. Standing here in the dark, you can feel how long ago that was. 200 years is a long time. 300 years is longer. The people who lived through 1692 are dust now. The houses they fought over have been torn down and rebuilt and torn down again. The fields have changed hands so many times that nobody alive today can trace a straight line back to what was taken. But the records are still there. The deeds are still there. The court documents, the complaint filings, the land surveys, the wills, all of it preserved in archives and libraries and county offices across Massachusetts. Anyone who wants to look can look. The story is written in ink on paper that has survived 3 centuries of New England winters. The wind picks up a little. The dry grass bends and whispers. Somewhere far off, an owl calls once and goes quiet. You look up at those stars again. They're the same stars that hung over this field in 1692. The same cold light falling on the same hard ground. The people who stood here then looked up at this same sky and believed they were living through something holy and terrible. believed God was watching. They believed the devil was close. Maybe they were right about one thing. Something was close. Something hungry and patient and very interested in who owned what. It just wasn't the devil. It was the oldest force in human history. The desire to take what belongs to someone else and find a reason that sounds like justice. "300 years is a long time to carry something. The town of Salem carried it anyway. Through every generation, through every cold Massachusetts winter, through every child who grew up hearing the names of the dead. The weight of 1692 never really left. It settled into the soil like frost. It stayed in the walls of the old houses. It lived in the way people talked about their neighbors, quietly, carefully, always with one eye on the door. The first real apology came in 1711. The Massachusetts General Court passed a bill. It reversed the convictions of some of the accused. It paid small amounts of money to the surviving families, £28 for one family, 12 for another. The numbers were almost insulting. A life measured in coins. But it was something. It was the colony admitting, in its careful legal language, that something had gone wrong. What it didn't say was why. The court didn't talk about land. It didn't talk about Thomas Putnam. It didn't talk about the property lines that shifted after the hangings. It used words like error and ignorance. It made the whole thing sound like a mistake anyone could have made. A bad season. A moment of collective confusion. Then it moved on. The families who lost the most didn't move on. They couldn't afford to. Some of them spent decades trying to get their land back. Some of them never did. The Nurse family, Rebecca's people, fought for years to clear her name. They finally got it in 1711 in that same bill. But the farm was already changed. The neighbors who had benefited from the chaos weren't eager to give anything back. Cleared names didn't clear debts. They didn't return the years. Salem Village itself slowly disappeared. Not all at once, but piece by piece. In 1752, it finally broke away from Salem town and became its own place. They called it Danvers, a new name for a place that wanted to forget. The residents of Danvers spent the next 2 centuries doing exactly that. They didn't celebrate 1692. They didn't build monuments. They kept their heads down and planted their fields and tried to be ordinary. Salem town took a different path. Salem kept the name and eventually kept the story. The city that had once tried to distance itself from the trials slowly realized that the trials were the thing people remembered. By the 19th century, writers were already coming to Salem. Nathaniel Hawthorne was born there in 1804. He was so troubled by his ancestors' role in the trials, Judge John Hathorne, that he added a W to his last name. He wanted the distance. He wrote The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, and filled both books with the shadow of Puritan guilt. He never quite escaped it. Neither did the city. The formal apology, the one that used the word apology, took much longer. In 1957, Massachusetts issued a resolution. It expressed regret. It was careful and quiet, and most people didn't notice. Then, in 1992, 300 years after the trials, the state put up a memorial in Salem. 20 stone benches, one for each person executed, their names carved in granite. The benches face inward toward each other, like people sitting in a circle, like a community that finally decided to look at itself. Ann Putnam Jr. had done something like that much earlier in her own way. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and read a public confession. She said she had been deceived by Satan. She asked forgiveness from the families she had helped destroy. It was the only public apology any of the accusers ever gave. Historians argue about what it meant. Some say she meant every word. Some say she was protecting what was left of her reputation. Maybe both things were true at once. The last legal piece fell into place in 2001. Massachusetts formally exonerated the remaining accused by name. Every single one. It took 309 years to say, plainly, that these people were innocent, that the court had been wrong, that the law had failed them. 309 years. You have to sit with that number for a moment. Think about how many generations that is. How many children grew up in the shadow of those names before the state finally said the word innocent out loud. Think about what it means for a place to carry a wrong that long, what it does to the soil, what it does to the people who grow up in it. Salem knows. Danvers knows. The whole coast of Massachusetts knows, in the way that old places always know the things they've done and can't undo. There is a name that never made it onto the memorial wall in Salem. Most people walk right past that fact. They read the carved letters, they nod, they take their photographs. But somewhere out in the country, far from the coast, there are families who still carry a different list. A longer one, written not in stone, but in memory, passed from grandmother to grandchild like a folded letter no one is allowed to throw away. Her name was Mary Easty. You heard about her earlier. She was hanged on September 22nd, 1692, along with 7 others on the same gray morning. But Mary had a sister. Her name was Sarah Cloyce, and Sarah survived. She was accused, yes. She sat in a cold jail cell for months. She watched the world outside go mad. But when the courts finally stopped, Sarah walked out. She was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. Sarah Cloyce eventually left Salem. She moved west, the way people did when a place had taken too much from them. She remarried. She built a new life in a town that didn't know her name or her history. She had children. Those children had children. And somewhere in that long chain of generations, the story of what happened in Salem became a family secret. Not shameful, just heavy, the kind of weight you carry in your chest on quiet nights. Descendants of the accused families spread across New England and then beyond. Into New York, into Pennsylvania, down into Virginia and the Carolinas. They brought the story with them the way you bring a scar. You don't always show it, but it's always there. Some of them changed their names, not out of shame exactly, more out of exhaustion. The name Nurse, the name Corey, the name Easty. These names had been dragged through the mud of a public trial. Some families quietly let them go. They became Norris. They became Corey with a different spelling. Small changes, enough to start fresh, but the story never fully disappeared. It lived in the way certain grandmothers would go quiet when someone mentioned witches. It lived in the way some families kept their distance from organized religion. even generations later. It lived in old letters found in attic trunks, written in faded ink, describing things that happened in a village most of the family had never seen. There is a town in western Massachusetts where a woman named Patience Easty is buried. She was born decades after the trials. She never set foot in Salem, but her family named her after the memory. That name was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, we remember who we were before all of this. The wanderers carried more than grief. They carried details, specific, strange, particular details that never made it into the court records. Stories about which neighbors had been kind. Stories about who had slipped food through a jail window. Stories about the exact look on a face when a verdict was read. These things lived in the oral tradition of scattered families long after the official history had been written and shelved. And here is something worth sitting with. The memorial in Salem lists the names of those who were executed. 20 people. It is a beautiful and solemn place, but the accused numbered in the hundreds. Most of them survived. Most of them went home to broken lives, ruined farms, and communities that never quite trusted them again. Their names are not on any wall. Their suffering doesn't have a monument. The descendants of those survivors are everywhere. They are in Ohio and Oregon and Georgia. They are in cities and small towns and places that have never heard of Salem except as a Halloween reference. They carry a piece of this story without always knowing the full shape of it. Some of them have found each other in recent years. Genealogy websites and old church records have stitched the lines back together. A woman in Colorado discovers her 6th great-grandmother was accused and jailed and then quietly released. A man in Florida finds a letter his ancestor wrote from a prison cell in 1692. These moments are small and private. They don't make the news, but they matter. The story of Salem didn't end at the gallows. It didn't end with the apologies or the memorials or the history books. It walked out of that village in the bodies of survivors. It crossed rivers and mountains. It settled into new soil and grew into something quieter, but just as real. The names nobody put on the memorial are still out there, scattered and alive, carried by people who may not even know they're carrying them. Salem is a small city now. It sits on the Massachusetts coast like a town that never quite decided what it wanted to be. The harbor is quiet most mornings. Seagulls wheel over the water. The old streets still curve the way they curved 300 years ago, following the same paths the Puritans wore into the earth with their boots. But walk those streets in October and something shifts. The whole city turns itself inside out. Witches appear on every corner. Not the frightened women who were dragged to Gallows Hill. These witches wear velvet capes and carry crystal balls. They set up tables in the town square and read tarot cards for tourists who wait in long, patient lines. The shop windows fill with black cats and cauldrons and little paper skeletons. The smell of cinnamon and candle wax drifts out of every open door. Salem has made itself into something, a destination, a story you can walk through. Every October, hundreds of thousands of people come to see it. They come from every state. They come from other countries. They stand in front of the old courthouse and take photographs. They visit the Witch Trials Memorial, that quiet stone plaza where the names are carved into granite benches. They buy books and candles and little pewter charms shaped like moons. The city earns millions of dollars every single year from a tragedy that killed 19 people and destroyed dozens of families. There is something strange about that, something worth sitting with. The people who run Salem's museums and heritage sites work hard to tell the real story. They talk about the land disputes. They talk about the fear and the politics and the way ordinary people got swept up in something they couldn't control. They put the names of the accused on plaques and in pamphlets. They try to give the dead their dignity back. And still, outside those careful museums, the city sells the myth. The pointy hats, the bubbling cauldrons, the image of the witch as something dark and powerful and a little bit fun. The very thing the Puritans feared, Salem now sells as a costume. The accused women of 1692 would not recognize any of it. They were farmers' wives. They were old women who argued with their neighbors. They were servants and midwives and girls who had nothing at all. They were not magical. were not powerful. They were people caught in a machine that had already decided what they were, and the machine ground them up. So what does Salem owe them now? That question doesn't have a clean answer. The city has built memorials. The state of Massachusetts formally exonerated the last of the accused in 2022, 330 years after the hangings. Politicians gave speeches. People cried. It felt like a closing of something. But the shops are still open. The tourists still come. The story still gets told in 100 different ways, some careful and some careless, some reverent and some dressed up in a Halloween costume. And underneath all of it, the older question still sits there. Quiet, patient, the way old questions do. Was it really about the land? The records say yes. The property lines say yes. The names of the accusers and the names of the accused line up in ways that are too neat to be coincidence. Thomas Putnam's signature appears on accusation after accusation. The land his family wanted appears in deed after deed. The pattern is there if you look for it. But patterns are not proof, and human beings are complicated. Fear is real. Belief is real. A Puritan farmer in 1692 genuinely thought the devil walked the earth and could reach into a person's soul and turn them against God. That terror was not pretend. It lived in people's bodies. It kept them awake at night. So maybe it was both things at once. Maybe greed and fear wore each other's clothes. Maybe some men used the hysteria to grab what they wanted, and other men were simply terrified. And the two things fed each other until 19 people were dead, and nobody could quite explain how it had happened. That is the part that stays with you. Not the land records, not the court transcripts, not even the names on the memorial wall, though those matter most of all. What stays with you is the simpler, harder question. How does a community turn on itself? How do ordinary people become part of something terrible? How does it start so small, with two girls shaking in a cold farmhouse, and end with bodies on a hill? Salem is still trying to answer that. So are we. The fire is low now. The last log has burned down to a soft orange glow, and the ash is pale and quiet at the edges. You've been sitting with this story for a long time tonight, and the story has been sitting with you. Salem is still there. It always has been. The town stands on the same ground it always did. The same rocky New England soil. The same gray winters that press down like a heavy hand. The same salt air rolling in off the harbor, carrying the smell of cold water and old wood. The streets have different names now. The buildings are different shapes. But the ground underneath is the same ground where all of it happened. People walk those streets every single day. They buy coffee. They check their phones. They walk past old stone walls without looking twice. And underneath all of that ordinary life, the old story breathes. Quiet, patient, still unfinished. Because here is the thing about Salem. The trials ended. The hangings stopped. The court dissolved. The apologies came slowly over centuries, like water wearing down stone. But the question at the center of it all never got a clean answer. Nobody ever stood up in a room full of witnesses and said plainly, this was about land. This was about money. This was about men who wanted what their neighbors had and found a way to take it. They never said that. Not officially. Not in writing that everyone agreed on. So the question stays open. It drifts through the old records like smoke through a cracked window. It lives in the property maps and the court documents and the family trees of the people who lost everything and the people who gained everything in the same terrible season. The evidence is there. It has always been there. But evidence and truth are not always the same thing. Sometimes truth is just the story that enough people agree to tell. And people have been telling this one for over 300 years. That is not nothing. That is remarkable. Most stories from 1692 are dust. Most names from that year are gone, worn smooth by time, forgotten the way most things are forgotten. But the names from Salem stayed. Betty Paris, Tituba, Bridget Bishop, Giles Corey, who stood in a field and refused to break. They stayed because people kept saying them, kept writing them down, kept asking why. The why is what keeps a story alive. You can drive to Danvers, Massachusetts, which used to be Salem Village, the poorer half, the farming half, the half where most of the accused came from. You can stand in a field that was once someone's pasture. The grass is long and green in summer, gold in fall, buried under snow in the deep months of January and February. The sky above it is the same sky that hung over all of it, wide and gray and full of clouds moving fast. There is a stillness to that place that is hard to describe. Not an eerie stillness, not a heavy or dark one, just the stillness of old ground that has seen a great deal and is no longer surprised by anything. The kind of quiet that only comes after a very long time has passed. The memorial in Salem town has all the names now. 19 who were hanged, 1 who was pressed, the ones who died in jail waiting for a trial that would have killed them anyway. Their names are cut into stone. Stone lasts longer than paper, longer than memory, longer than the people who wronged them, and the people who mourned them, and the people who built towns on top of everything that happened. Stone just stays. And somewhere in the quiet of a New England night, when the last light is out, and the streets are empty, and the harbor is black and still under a sky full of cold stars, the story rests, not finished, not resolved, but resting, the way all old things rest, with a kind of dignity that comes from simply having lasted. You know the story now. You've held it for a few hours. You've walked through the cold winter of 1692 and come out the other side. And now the fire is just coals. The night is deep and soft around you. The world outside is quiet. You can set the story down. It will be here when you come back to it. Stories like this one always are. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night, one tap, and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.